Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Mountain's Edge. The Andes stretched endlessly before Barry Rasmussen as he adjusted his scope, the thin mountain air burning his lungs with each controlled breath. At 42, he'd spent half his life in places like this. Remote, hostile, where the line between mission success and body bag was measured in heartbeats. 15 years of special forces had taught him patience, precision, and the art of making hard choices in impossible situations. Target acquired, he whispered into his throat mic, watching the compound below through thermal imaging. 3 months of surveillance had led to this moment. A drug cartel's financial hub nestled in the Colombian mountains, protected by geography and corruption in equal measure. The satellite phone's shrill ring cut through the mountain's silence like a blade. Barry's finger froze on the trigger. Nobody called during operations unless the world was ending. His spotter, a young CIA operative named Torres, looked at him with questioning eyes. Barry had learned to trust his instincts. Something was wrong. He'd built his life on control compartments. The warrior who disappeared into shadow operations, and the family man who coached Little League and helped with algebra homework. For 12 years, he'd kept those worlds separate through careful planning and ironclad discipline. His wife Lindsay understood the absences, the vague explanations, the way he'd sometimes wake up reaching for weapons that weren't there. Their daughter Ada was his anchor, 16 years old, brilliant, kind, with her mother's green eyes and his stubborn streak. She'd inherited his tactical mind, often solving complex problems with the same methodical approach he brought to operations. When she was 8, she disassembled and reassembled her bicycle after Barry had mentioned that understanding how things work was the key to fixing them when they break. The phone rang again. Through his earpiece, his handler's voice crackled with static. "Rasmussen, you're compromised. We've got movement on the East Ridge." But Barry's attention was locked on that phone. In 23 years of marriage, Lindsay had never called during a mission. Ever. She understood the protocol, the dangers, the sacred rule that operational compartments stayed sealed. The third ring felt like an eternity. He signaled Torres to maintain overwatch and pulled back from the ridge, his mind already racing through contingencies. The mission could wait. Everything could wait. He answered on the fourth ring. "Barry." Lindsay's voice was raw, broken in a way that made his blood freeze. In all their years together, through deployments and close calls, through the dark nights when he'd come home carrying pieces of wars in distant places, he'd never heard her sound like this. "What happened?" His voice dropped to the tone he used in crisis situations. Calm, controlled, ready. "Ada." The word came out strangled, followed by a sob that cut through satellite static like a scream. "She's in the ICU. Oh God, Barry, what he did to her." The world tilted. Barry's hand tightened on the phone as his training warred with panic. His daughter. His Ada. The little girl who still fell asleep reading tactical manuals she'd stolen from his study. "Tell me everything. Now." Through broken sentences, the story emerged. A party at her friend's house. Supervised, safe, the kind of normal teenage activity they'd cautiously allowed. A young man, older, charming. Ada had been careful, hadn't been drinking, had stayed with friends. But sometime during the evening, she'd been separated from her group. They found her 3 hours later in the host family's guest room, unconscious, brutalized. The physical injuries were severe: broken ribs, concussion, defensive wounds on her hands where she'd fought back. But the other injuries, the ones Lindsay couldn't bring herself to name over the phone, painted a picture that made Barry's vision go white with rage. "The boy who did this." Barry's voice was deadly quiet. "Tell me about him." "Hector Sanders. He's..." Lindsay's voice cracked again. "His father's some kind of diplomat." "Barry, they're protecting him. They called it a diplomatic incident. He's already gone. On a plane back to wherever he came from. They said there's nothing we can do. Diplomatic immunity." The phrase hit Barry like a physical blow. He'd seen it before, in places where American officials walked away from consequences, where local justice bent to international politics. But this was his daughter. This was Ada. "The doctors say she fought back hard." Lindsay continued. "She got DNA under her fingernails. left scratches on his face. But it doesn't matter. His father has immunity, and apparently it extends to family. They're untouchable, Barry. The police are treating it like a closed case. Barry looked out at the Andes peaks, their snow-covered summits gleaming in the afternoon sun. Somewhere below, drug traffickers were moving millions in blood money. But that seemed impossibly small now, irrelevant compared to the rage building in his chest like a nuclear reactor approaching critical mass. He'd spent his career following orders, working within systems, believing that justice eventually found its way to those who deserved it. But watching his daughter's attacker disappear behind diplomatic shields was teaching him the limits of that faith. "Barry, are you there? I'm coming home." His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Right now, he signaled to Torres, drawing a finger across his throat. Mission abort. The young agent's eyes widened in surprise, but Barry was already moving, breaking down his position with the mechanical efficiency of decades of training. As he gathered his equipment, Barry's mind was already working the problem with the same methodical precision he brought to every mission. Hector Sanders had hurt his daughter and hidden behind diplomatic immunity. But immunity was just another form of protection, and Barry had spent his entire adult life learning how to defeat protection. The satellite phone was still warm in his hand when he made a decision that would change everything. Some fights were worth starting, regardless of the consequences. Some people forfeited their right to safety the moment they decided to destroy innocence. His daughter had fought back. Lindsay had made that clear. Ada was a fighter just like him. Now it was time to show her what happened when someone hurt a Rasmussen. The extraction helicopter was already inbound, its rotors beating against the thin mountain air. Barry shouldered his pack and started down the slope, leaving behind one mission to begin another. This one wouldn't be sanctioned by any government or bound by any rules of engagement. This one was personal. Chapter 2. Homecoming. The ICU's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across Ada's face as Barry stood in the doorway, feeling something inside his chest crack and reshape itself into something harder, more dangerous. 27 hours of travel. Helicopters, cargo planes, commercial flights had brought him from the Colombian Andes to St. Mary's Hospital, but the journey felt like crossing between two different realities. His daughter lay unconscious, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. Her face was a map of purple and yellow bruises, her left arm in a cast, her breathing assisted by a ventilator. But it was the defensive wounds on her hands that destroyed something in Barry's soul, evidence that his 16-year-old daughter had fought for her life against a predator. Lindsay rose from the bedside chair, her own face gaunt with exhaustion and trauma. She'd been a trauma nurse for 18 years, had seen violence in all its forms, but this was different. This was their baby. "The doctors say she's stable," Lindsay whispered as Barry pulled her into his arms. "Dr. McGee, Della McGee, she's the best we have." But Barry, the psychological trauma. She didn't finish the sentence. Barry held his wife while studying his daughter with the analytical eye of a professional soldier. The injuries were consistent with prolonged assault. This hadn't been a moment of poor judgment or drunken mistake. This was methodical, sadistic. Whoever Hector Sanders was, he'd enjoyed what he'd done. "Tell me about the investigation." Lindsay pulled back, her green eyes flashing with a fury that matched his own. "What investigation?" Detective Martinez spent an hour taking statements, then got a call from someone downtown. Suddenly, it became a federal matter requiring diplomatic sensitivity. The evidence kit's been sealed, the witness statements classified. It's like Ada doesn't matter because the wrong person hurt her. Barry's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before in overseas operations. Powerful people using their positions to avoid consequences. But seeing it applied to his family was radicalizing in a way that surprised him with its intensity. What do we know about the Sanders family? Hugo Sanders is a senior diplomat with the Embassy of Moldavia. Apparently, they've been in the U.S. for 3 years. The son, Hector, is 22, officially listed as a cultural attaché, or some nonsense. "Barry, I did some digging." Lindsay's voice dropped to a whisper. This isn't his first time. The words hit Barry like shrapnel. Explain. Eleanor Young. She's an investigative reporter with the Post. I reached out to her after the police stonewalled us. She says there have been whispers about Hector Sanders for months. 3 other incidents in the D.C. area, all involving young women, all disappeared into diplomatic channels. Eleanor's been trying to build a story, but every source gets threatened. Every piece of evidence vanishes into bureaucratic black holes. Barry processed this information with the methodical efficiency that had kept him alive through 2 decades of dangerous missions. A pattern of predatory behavior, protected by diplomatic immunity, enabled by a system that valued international relations over justice for victims. Where is he now? Moldova, supposedly. His father had him on a diplomatic flight 8 hours after Ada was found. But Eleanor thinks that's not the whole story. She's been tracking their movements, and there are inconsistencies in the official reports. A soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Della McGee entered, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and competent hands. Barry recognized the type from military medical facilities, people who'd seen too much trauma but refused to let it harden them completely. Mr. Rasmussen, I wanted to update you on Ada's condition. She glanced at the monitors surrounding his daughter. Physically, she's responding well to treatment. The internal injuries are healing, the concussion is resolving, and we expect to remove the ventilator tomorrow. But the psychological trauma, Barry finished. Yes, when she regains consciousness, she's going to need extensive support. What happened to her was... Dr. McGee paused, choosing her words carefully. It was intentionally cruel. Whoever did this wanted to cause maximum psychological damage along with the physical assault. Barry's hands curled into fists at his sides. The clinical language couldn't soften the reality. Someone had tortured his daughter for pleasure, then disappeared behind diplomatic protection. Doctor, in your professional opinion, was this person experienced? Had he done this before? Dr. McGee met his eyes directly. Off the record? Yes. The pattern of injuries suggests someone who knew exactly how to maximize trauma while avoiding life-threatening damage. This was someone with practice. After Dr. McGee left, Barry and Lindsay sat in silence beside Ada's bed, watching their daughter breathe with mechanical assistance. The hospital's routine sounds, beeping monitors, distant conversations, the soft whisper of air circulation, created a backdrop for the dark thoughts forming in Barry's mind. What are you thinking? Lindsay asked, recognizing the expression he wore when planning complex operations. I'm thinking about justice. Barry's voice was calm, controlled, but Lindsay heard the steel underneath. The system failed Ada. It failed those other girls. It's going to keep failing until someone makes it stop. Barry, what does that mean? He looked at his daughter's bruised face, at the defensive wounds on her hands, at the machines keeping her stable while she fought internal battles he couldn't help her with. Then he looked at his wife, the woman who'd stood by him through deployments and dangerous missions, who'd understood that sometimes good people had to do hard things to protect innocence. It means Hector Sanders made a mistake when he chose our family. Barry's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Diplomatic immunity protects him from legal consequences. It doesn't protect him from me. Lindsay studied her husband's face, seeing the transformation that occurred when Barry Rasmussen shifted from protective father to tactical operator. She'd witnessed it before, in smaller ways, the focused intensity he brought to any threat against his family. But this was different. This was the look of a man who'd moved past law and order into the realm of personal justice. What do you need from me? The question didn't surprise him. 23 years of marriage had taught them both that some fights required complete commitment from both partners. Ada was their daughter, their shared creation, their joined responsibility to protect. Information. Access. The kind of details Eleanor Young can't get through normal channels. Barry squeezed his wife's hand. And when this is over, I need you to help Ada heal from what he did to her. What about what you're going to do to him? Barry looked at his daughter again, at the evidence of calculated cruelty inflicted on someone he loved more than his own life. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who'd crossed a line and found peace on the other side. He's going to learn that diplomatic immunity expires the moment I decide it does. Chapter 3. Reconnaissance. The coffee shop on Wisconsin Avenue looked innocuous enough. The kind of place where Georgetown students nursed laptops and overpriced lattes. But Barry had chosen it for its sight lines, multiple exits, and location exactly 6 blocks from the Moldovan embassy. After 48 hours of preparation, he was ready for his first face-to-face with the enemy. Eleanor Young arrived precisely on time, sliding into the booth across from him with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to clandestine meetings. At 38, she had the sharp-eyed intensity of a reporter who'd spent years digging into stories other people wanted buried. "You're exactly what I expected," she said, studying Barry's weathered face and military posture. "Lindsay said you were Special Forces. The kind who doesn't officially exist. Former Special Forces. Now I consult on security matters." Barry's cover story was technically true, though it omitted his current status as a private contractor specializing in operations that governments couldn't officially sanction. "Tell me about Hector Sanders." Eleanor opened her tablet, revealing a digital file that spoke to months of careful investigation. Hector Victor Sanders, age 22, son of Hugo Sanders, Moldovan ambassador to the United States. Officially, he's a cultural attaché working on student exchange programs. Unofficially, he's a predator who uses diplomatic immunity like a hunting license. She swiped to a series of photographs, surveillance shots, social media images, and hospital records that should have been confidential. Barry recognized the methodical work of a professional investigator. 3 documented cases in the past 18 months, all with the same pattern. Hector targets young women at social events, isolates them, and assaults them with calculated cruelty. The victims report to police, evidence is collected, and then everything disappears into diplomatic channels. Barry studied the images of previous victims, young women with the same haunted expression he'd seen in Ada's eyes during her brief moments of consciousness. Each photograph was a testament to systematic failure of justice. What about before D.C.? That's where it gets interesting. Eleanor's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. The Sanders family served in Vienna for 2 years before coming to the U.S. I have contacts at Austrian newspapers who remember similar incidents, but the records are even more thoroughly buried. This has been going on for years, Barry. He's not just a predator. He's an international predator protected by diplomatic immunity. The information aligned with Barry's tactical assessment. Hector Sanders wasn't acting impulsively. He was operating with the systematic approach of someone who understood how to exploit legal protections for personal gratification. Where is he now? That's complicated. Eleanor pulled up a series of flight records and diplomatic communications. Officially, he returned to Moldova the night after assaulting Ada. But my sources at State suggest that's not entirely accurate. Diplomatic flights don't always file standard passenger manifests, and there are irregularities in the paperwork. Barry leaned forward, his interest sharpening. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggest Hector Sanders might not have left the country at all. Hugo Sanders has a private residence in the Cayman Islands, officially a vacation property, unofficially a place where diplomatic personnel can conduct business away from official scrutiny. My financial contacts suggest recent activity on accounts tied to that property. The implications were clear. Hector Sanders was hiding in a jurisdiction where his father's influence could provide additional layers of protection. But Barry had operated in the Caribbean during his military career. He understood the region's geography, politics, and the kind of people who could be persuaded to cooperate with the right incentives. I need everything you have on the Cayman property. Eleanor hesitated, recognizing the shift in Barry's tone from information gathering to operational planning. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that diplomatic immunity has geographic limitations. Barry's voice carried the cold calculation of someone who'd spent decades finding weaknesses in seemingly impregnable defenses. And I'm thinking that sometimes justice requires personal delivery. They were interrupted by Barry's phone. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Hospital, and Barry felt his heart skip before Dr. McGee's voice brought welcome news. "Mr. Rasmussen?" Ada's awake. She's asking for you. Barry was moving before the call ended, leaving money on the table and heading for the door with Eleanor close behind. The drive to the hospital was a blur of DC traffic and mounting anticipation. His daughter was conscious, alert, finally able to communicate what had been done to her. At St. Mary's, they found Ada propped up in her hospital bed, the ventilator gone, and her green eyes focused with determined clarity. She looked fragile, surrounded by medical equipment, but Barry recognized the expression on her face. It was the same focused intensity he brought to mission planning. "Dad," her voice was hoarse but strong. "I remember everything." Lindsay squeezed Ada's uninjured hand while Barry pulled a chair close to the bed. "Sweetheart, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Ada's voice carried a steel that reminded Barry of himself at that age. Young but unbreakable, damaged but not defeated. He needs to pay for what he did, not just to me, but to the others. Barry felt pride and heartbreak in equal measure. His daughter had inherited more than his tactical mind. She'd inherited his sense of justice and his refusal to accept defeat. "Tell me what you remember." Ada's account was delivered with clinical precision, despite the obvious emotional cost. Hector Sanders had approached her at the party with practiced charm, claimed to be a graduate student interested in her college plans. He'd been patient, building trust, waiting until her friends were distracted before suggesting they move to a quieter location. He knew exactly what he was doing, Ada said, her voice steady despite tears running down her cheeks. "This wasn't impulsive. He planned it, Dad. He enjoyed it. And when I fought back, he told me that nobody would believe me, that his father would make sure nothing happened to him." The words hit Barry like physical blows, but he maintained his composure for Ada's sake. His daughter had faced a predator with courage and intelligence, fighting back despite being overpowered, surviving through the same tactical mindset he'd taught her since childhood. "He was right about one thing," Barry said quietly. "The system can't touch him. But he was wrong about everything else." Ada studied her father's face, recognizing the expression she'd seen when he'd dealt with bullies who'd threatened her in middle school, when neighborhood criminals had tested their family security, when anyone had made the mistake of targeting the people Barry Rasmussen loved. "What are you going to do?" Barry looked at his daughter, bruised but unbroken, traumatized but determined to see justice done. Then he looked at his wife, who nodded with the understanding that came from 23 years of shared purpose. "I'm going to show Hector Sanders what happens when diplomatic immunity meets personal accountability." Eleanor, who'd been quietly observing the family dynamic, cleared her throat. "I want to help." Barry turned to study the reporter, recognizing the same determined fury that drove his own mission. "This isn't going to be a story you can print. I know, but those other girls deserve justice too, and the system failed them just like it failed Ada. Sometimes justice requires more than journalism." Barry looked around the hospital room, at his daughter recovering from calculated cruelty, at his wife carrying the trauma of almost losing their child, at a reporter willing to risk her career for justice. He thought about Hector Sanders hiding behind diplomatic immunity, confident that his father's position made him untouchable. It was time to prove him wrong. Chapter 4. The Network. Barry's basement office looked like a military command center designed by someone with unlimited resources and 20 years of paranoia. Multiple monitors displayed satellite imagery, financial records, travel documents, and surveillance footage. Maps of the Cayman Islands covered one wall, marked with precise notations about security protocols, local law enforcement, and private military contractors. Charlie Serrano arrived at dawn, moving through Barry's security system with the casual efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for 15 years. At 45, Charlie retained the compact build and alert eyes of a special operations veteran, though civilian life had softened his edges marginally. He ran a private security firm that provided discreet services to clients who preferred solutions outside legal channels. "You look like hell," Charlie said, studying Barry's haggard appearance. 2 weeks of 18-hour research days had taken their toll. "I feel worse." Barry gestured to the monitors displaying their target. "Tell me what you see." Charlie studied the intelligence package with professional appreciation. Hugo Sanders owned a compound on 7 Mile Beach, 12,000 square feet of luxury architecture surrounded by private security and geographic isolation. The property featured its own dock, helicopter pad, and a security system that rivaled military installations. Serious money, serious protection, serious problems for anyone thinking about uninvited visits, Charlie observed. But not impossible. What's the objective? Justice, Barry said simply. Be more specific. Barry pulled up medical records and crime scene photographs, not just from Ada's assault, but from 6 other victims across 3 countries. Eleanor Young's investigation had uncovered a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 5 years, all protected by diplomatic immunity and powerful connections. Hector Sanders has been systematically targeting young women for half a decade. 8 documented victims, probably more who were too frightened or discouraged to report. The system can't touch him because of diplomatic immunity, but I can. Charlie studied the evidence with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent years dealing with people who thought power made them untouchable. What kind of justice are we talking about? The permanent kind. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of a decision that would transform Barry from protective father to something darker, more final. Charlie had worked with Barry long enough to understand that this wasn't a moment of emotional reaction. It was a calculated choice made by someone who'd exhausted legal alternatives. You understand what you're asking me to participate in. I understand exactly what I'm asking. And I understand that you have every right to walk away. Barry's voice carried no judgment, no pressure, just the calm certainty of someone who'd already committed to a course of action regardless of support. Charlie was quiet for several minutes, studying the evidence and weighing the moral complexity of the situation. He'd seen enough of the world to understand that legal justice and actual justice weren't always the same thing. And he'd worked with Barry long enough to trust his judgment about when the system failed so completely that personal action became necessary. What's the plan? Barry smiled for the first time in weeks. Not the cold expression of tactical planning, but genuine appreciation for friendship that transcended legal boundaries. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its precision. Hugo Sanders maintained his Cayman compound as a refuge for conducting business that required privacy from official oversight. That same privacy would work against him when Barry arrived uninvited. Eleanor Young had provided additional intelligence through her network of investigative contacts. Hector Sanders was definitely in the Caymans, but not alone. He'd brought 2 friends from his diplomatic circle, turning his exile into an extended vacation funded by his father's wealth. 3 targets instead of 1, Charlie noted, plus whatever security the old man has in place. The security is substantial but predictable, Barry said, pulling up detailed schematics of the compound. Private contractors from Blackstone Security, professional, well-equipped, but operating under rules of engagement that assume conventional threats. They're not prepared for someone with our skill set and complete disregard for legal consequences. The tactical challenge was significant but manageable. Barry had spent his career infiltrating defended positions, and the Sanders compound, for all its expensive security, was designed to deter criminals and paparazzi, not special operations veterans with personal motivation. Timeline: 2 weeks to finalize intelligence and acquire necessary equipment. 1 week for infiltration and position establishment. Then we move. Charlie nodded, recognizing the methodical approach that had kept them alive through dozens of dangerous missions. What about extraction? Optional. The word carried implications that made Charlie study Barry's face with renewed concern. He'd seen friends cross lines during his military career. Good men who'd been pushed past their breaking point by circumstances that demanded more than conventional responses. Barry was approaching that line. Maybe had already crossed it. Barry, your family needs you alive. My family needs justice for what was done to them. If I can provide that and survive, excellent. If I can only provide justice. Barry shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of someone who'd made peace with consequences. Ada deserves to know that the man who hurt her faced accountability for his actions. They were interrupted by Eleanor Young's arrival, carrying fresh intelligence that changed everything. Her investigation had uncovered evidence of an additional victim, a diplomatic aide's daughter in Vienna, who'd committed suicide after reporting assault by Hector Sanders. The case had been buried so thoroughly that even Eleanor's contacts had missed it initially. Her name was Isabella Hoffman, Eleanor said, her voice thick with rage. 17 years old, honor student, wanted to study international relations. She reported the assault to Austrian authorities, was told it was a diplomatic matter beyond their jurisdiction, and killed herself 3 weeks later. Barry felt something inside his chest calcify into permanent hardness. 9 victims. At least 9 young women whose lives have been destroyed by a predator who treated diplomatic immunity like a hunting license. Her parents moved to Canada afterward. Eleanor continued. But I tracked them down. They want to help. The Hoffman family's tragedy added weight to Barry's mission while providing additional resources. Klaus Hoffman had been an Austrian intelligence officer before his daughter's death drove him into bitter retirement. He possessed both the skills and motivation to support an operation against the Sanders family. We're not talking about vigilante justice anymore, Charlie observed. This has started to look like an international coalition. Good, Barry said with quiet satisfaction. Hector Sanders operated internationally. So will we. As they refined their operational plan, Barry felt the familiar calm that came with mission preparation. For 20 years, he'd channeled his protective instincts through official channels, working within systems designed to maintain order and protect innocence. But those systems had failed his daughter, failed Isabella Hoffman, failed every young woman who'd encountered Hector Sanders and been told that diplomatic immunity made justice impossible. It was time to prove that some forms of justice operated outside diplomatic protection. 3 weeks later, Barry stood on the deck of a charter fishing boat 12 miles off Grand Cayman, watching the lights of the Sanders compound through high-powered binoculars. Charlie was beside him, checking equipment with the methodical precision of someone preparing for combat. Klaus Hoffman monitored radio frequencies from the boat's cabin, his weathered face set with the grim determination of a father seeking justice for his dead daughter. Last chance to reconsider, Charlie said quietly. Barry thought about Ada, recovering slowly but growing stronger each day. He thought about Isabella Hoffman, driven to suicide by the crushing weight of injustice. He thought about 8 other young women whose lives had been scarred by a predator who believed diplomatic immunity made him untouchable. Some people forfeit their right to legal protection when they decide to destroy innocence, Barry said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of absolute conviction. Hector Sanders made that choice when he chose our daughters. The boat's engines went silent. In the distance, the Sanders compound glowed with the artificial light of wealth and false security. It was time to deliver justice. Chapter 5, Infiltration. The Caribbean night wrapped around Barry like a familiar embrace as he slipped beneath the surface 1,200 yards from the Sanders compound. The water was warm, visibility clear, and a gentle current would carry him precisely where he needed to go. 25 years of amphibious operations had taught him to read water like terrain, and tonight every condition favored the hunter over the hunted. Charlie's voice crackled through his waterproof earpiece. Overwatch in position. Security rotation every 20 minutes for guards, night vision equipped but predictable patterns. You have a 12-minute window once you reach the dock. Barry acknowledged with 2 clicks and continued his approach. The compound security was impressive by civilian standards. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, roving patrols. But it was designed to deter conventional criminals, not someone with his specialized training and complete disregard for legal consequences. Klaus Hoffman's intelligence had been invaluable. The Austrian father's investigation into his daughter's death had uncovered financial records showing Hugo Sanders used the Cayman property for hosting diplomatic conferences that never appeared in official records. The isolation that protected those secret meetings would work against them tonight. Barry reached the compound's private dock as the security patrol completed its circuit. 12 minutes to infiltrate, locate targets, and establish position for the main operation. He moved through shadows with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent decades making the impossible look routine. The compound's layout matched Eleanor Young's intelligence. Main house, guest quarters, security station, and a separate building that served as Hugo Sanders' private office. Through thermal imaging, Barry could see 3 heat signatures in the guest quarters. Hector Sanders and his 2 companions, exactly where intelligence suggested they'd be. The security system was sophisticated but followed predictable patterns. Barry had studied similar installations during his military career, and he understood their weaknesses. Expensive technology couldn't compensate for lazy human implementation, and private security contractors rarely maintained the discipline necessary for true operational security. He disabled the perimeter sensors with equipment Charlie had acquired through channels that didn't maintain records. The intrusion would register as a minor system glitch, the kind of false alarm that expensive security systems generated regularly in saltwater environments. Barry's earpiece crackled with updates from his support team. Charlie maintained overwatch from a concealed position on the neighboring property, providing real-time intelligence on guard movements and compound activity. Klaus Hoffman monitored police and emergency services frequencies, while Eleanor Young tracked Hugo Sanders' location in Washington, D.C. The guest quarters were separated from the main house by 100 yards of landscaped grounds, beautiful in daylight, but providing excellent concealment for nighttime operations. Barry moved through gardens and decorative features with a methodical approach that had kept him alive through 2 decades of dangerous missions. Inside the guest quarters, Hector Sanders and his friends were enjoying their Caribbean exile with the casual arrogance of people who'd never faced genuine consequences for their actions. Through windows, Barry could see them drinking expensive whiskey and laughing about something that amused them greatly. Barry felt a cold fury settle over him as he recognized the target. Hector Sanders looked exactly like Eleanor Young's photographs. Tall, athletic, conventionally handsome in the way that had helped him charm his victims. At 22, he possessed the careless confidence of someone who'd learned that wealth and diplomatic protection could excuse any behavior. The 2 companions were similarly privileged, diplomatic brats whose fathers had used influence to shield them from accountability. Klaus Hoffman's research had identified them as accessories to at least 3 of Hector's assaults, men who'd helped isolate victims and covered up evidence afterward. Barry activated a small device that would interfere with the building's internal communications and cell phone reception. When this began, he wanted no interruptions, no calls for help, no diplomatic interference. This was going to be a conversation conducted entirely on his terms. He entered through a window that expensive security had left vulnerable, not because of poor design, but because wealthy people valued aesthetics over true protection. The window's sensor registered the breach, but Barry's equipment made it appear as environmental interference rather than intrusion. Moving through the guest quarters interior, Barry felt the familiar calm that came with mission execution. For weeks, he'd planned and prepared and gathered intelligence. Now it was time for direct action, personal justice delivered with precision and finality. Hector Sanders was pouring another drink when Barry emerged from the shadows, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd spent his career appearing uninvited in places where his presence changed everything. The young man looked up with casual curiosity, as if unexpected visitors were a normal part of his protected existence. "Gentlemen," Barry said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled menace of absolute authority. "We need to talk." The moment stretched as 3 young men processed the presence of someone who clearly didn't belong in their privileged sanctuary. Hector's companions reacted first, reaching for phones, starting to stand, beginning to voice objections that died as they recognized the cold professionalism in Barry's eyes. "Hector Sanders," Barry continued, his voice never rising above conversational volume. 22 years old, cultural attaché with diplomatic immunity, currently wanted by a father whose daughter you chose to destroy. Recognition dawned in Hector's eyes. Not fear, but the annoyed inconvenience of someone accustomed to having problems solved by other people. His expression carried the arrogance of someone who'd learned that diplomatic immunity made him untouchable. "I don't know who you are or how you got in here," Hector said, his voice carrying inherited authority. But you're making a serious mistake. My father is Ambassador Hugo Sanders, and this property enjoys diplomatic protection. You're committing an international incident. Barry smiled with the cold appreciation of someone who'd just heard his enemy explain why conventional justice couldn't reach him. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Chapter 6. Interrogation. The guest quarters living room became an interrogation facility with the addition of equipment Barry had carried in waterproof bags. Cable ties, portable lighting, recording devices, and instruments designed to encourage honesty through discomfort. The tools of someone who'd learned that truth often required persuasion. Hector Sanders sat bound to a heavy chair, his diplomatic arrogance beginning to crack as he realized his father's protection couldn't reach into this room. His two companions, Marcus Webb, son of a trade attaché, and Trevor Castillo, whose father worked in arms control, were secured to dining room chairs with the efficient brutality of someone who'd done this professionally. "Let me explain how this works," Barry said, adjusting a LED work light to shine directly into Hector's eyes. "You're going to tell me about every girl you've hurt, every assault, every victim, every time you used diplomatic immunity to escape justice. Complete honesty will make this easier. Lies will make it considerably more difficult." Hector tried to maintain his entitled composure despite cable ties cutting into his wrists and ankles. "You can't do this. I have diplomatic immunity. My father will have you extradited and imprisoned for kidnapping, assault, and violating international treaties." Barry pulled out his phone and showed Hector a photograph. Ada in her hospital bed, surrounded by machines and bandages, her face a map of purple bruises. "Your diplomatic immunity didn't protect my daughter from what you did to her. It's not going to protect you from what I'm going to do to you." The photograph had an immediate effect. Hector's eyes widened as he recognized the girl from the party, the victim who'd fought back harder than most. His companions shifted nervously in their chairs, finally understanding that they weren't dealing with conventional criminals who could be deterred by legal threats. "That wasn't." Hector's voice cracked slightly. "That was a misunderstanding. She was drunk, she was willing, and then she changed her mind afterward and claimed." Barry's backhand was measured, professional, designed to demonstrate commitment without causing serious damage. Hector's head snapped sideways, blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Wrong answer. Try again." Charlie's voice crackled through Barry's earpiece. "Compound security is maintaining normal patterns. You have time for extended conversation." Barry activated a digital recorder, placing it where all three captives could see it clearly. "This session is being documented. Your confessions will be forwarded to appropriate authorities, journalists, and families of your victims. Diplomatic immunity can't bury evidence that doesn't exist in official channels." The implications were clear. Whatever they said here would become public regardless of their father's influence. The protection they'd relied on for years was meaningless in this room, with this man under these circumstances. Marcus Webb, the weakest of the three, broke first. "Look, we never meant for anyone to get seriously hurt. Hector said his father could make problems disappear, that diplomatic immunity covered everything. We were just supposed to keep other people away while he what?" Barry's voice carried dangerous patience. "While he had fun with girls who wouldn't cooperate voluntarily." The confession hit Barry like a physical blow, confirming what he'd suspected. This wasn't impulsive violence, but organized predatory behavior. These young men had systematized the process of isolating and assaulting victims, confident that diplomatic protection made them untouchable. Barry pulled out a tablet, displaying photographs of all 9 victims: Ada, Isabella Hoffman, and 7 others whose lives have been shattered by the Sanders Group's activities. "Tell me about each one. Names, dates, locations, what you did to them." For the next 2 hours, Barry methodically extracted confessions that painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior spanning 3 countries and 5 years. Hector Sanders wasn't just a privileged young man with poor impulse control. He was a serial predator who'd learned to use diplomatic immunity as a hunting license. The details were horrific. Each assault had been planned, coordinated, and covered up through diplomatic channels. The victims had been chosen specifically for their vulnerability, young women without powerful connections, students from middle-class families, immigrants who feared deportation if they reported crimes. Isabella Hoffman had been targeted because her father was an intelligence officer. Hector had wanted to prove that even law enforcement families were powerless against diplomatic immunity. Her suicide had been celebrated as evidence of their untouchability. Barry forced himself to maintain professional detachment as the confessions continued. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary poor judgment. They were calculated acts of cruelty committed by predators who enjoyed the psychological destruction as much as the physical violence. Trevor Castillo provided the most damaging information: financial records showing payments to local officials, evidence of surveillance conducted on potential victims, and communications with Hugo Sanders discussing how to expand their activities to new locations. "Your father knew," Barry said to Hector. "He facilitated this. He said young men needed outlets." Hector replied, his diplomatic arrogance finally cracking completely. He said diplomatic immunity was meant to protect important people from local laws that didn't understand international necessities. The words crystallized Barry's understanding of the Sanders family's moral bankruptcy. This wasn't just criminal behavior enabled by diplomatic protection. It was criminal behavior that diplomatic protection had been deliberately designed to facilitate. Barry's earpiece crackled with an update from Klaus Hoffman. Hugo Sanders just left his D.C. residence. Flight plan filed for Grand Cayman. ETA, 4 hours. The timeline was accelerating. Hugo Sanders was coming to protect his son, bringing whatever diplomatic muscle and legal threats he could marshal. But Barry had what he needed: complete confessions, documented evidence, and 3 predators who'd finally faced accountability for their actions. He looked at Hector Sanders, bruised, terrified, stripped of the arrogance that diplomatic immunity had provided for years. The young man who'd systematically destroyed young women's lives was finally experiencing vulnerability, fear, and helplessness. "Your father's on his way," Barry said quietly. "He's going to arrive expecting to find you safe under diplomatic protection, ready to sweep this away like all the others. Instead, he's going to find justice." Barry activated his communication system, connecting to Charlie, Klaus, and Eleanor simultaneously. Phase 2 begins now. Hugo Sanders enters the game personally in 4 hours. Time to show him what happens when diplomatic immunity meets personal accountability. The interrogation was complete. Now came the reckoning. Chapter 7. The Ambassador Arrives. Hugo Sanders' helicopter touched down on the compound's private landing pad at 3:47 a.m., its rotors cutting through Caribbean air thick with impending storm clouds. At 58, the ambassador retained the imposing presence that had intimidated diplomats and politicians across 3 continents. But tonight he moved with the urgent desperation of a father whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. Barry watched from the main house's security office, having spent the previous hour studying Hugo's communications and understanding the full scope of the Sanders family's corruption. The ambassador hadn't just enabled his son's predatory behavior. He'd systematized it, using diplomatic resources to identify victims, plan assaults, and eliminate evidence. Eleanor Young's investigation had uncovered financial records showing payments to local police, medical professionals, and government officials across multiple countries. Hugo Sanders had created an international network designed to protect predators, turning diplomatic immunity into a comprehensive shield for systematic criminal behavior. "Compound security is moving to escort formation," Charlie reported through the earpiece. "Hugo's bringing 2 additional men, serious-looking, probably former military." Barry adjusted his position in the main house, maintaining visual contact with the guest quarters where Hector and his companions remained secured. The next few hours would determine whether justice could penetrate the layers of protection that had shielded the Sanders family for years. Hugo Sanders entered the main house with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to having his authority respected without question. His expensive suit was wrinkled from travel, but his eyes remained sharp with the cold calculation that had built his career on buried scandals and managed crises. "I know you're here," Hugo called into the house's shadows. "I know who you are, Barry Rasmussen, former special operations, current private contractor with a classified record and questionable mental stability following his daughter's accident. The words were calculated to demonstrate that Hugo had used his resources to investigate Barry, to show that diplomatic intelligence could reach anywhere. But they also revealed the ambassador's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he faced. Accident. Barry emerged from the shadows with a controlled menace that had intimidated enemies across 2 decades of dangerous missions. Is that what you're calling what your son did to my daughter? Hugo studied Barry with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent his career reading dangerous men and finding ways to neutralize them. Your daughter attended a party, consumed alcohol, and made poor choices that resulted in consequences she later regretted. My son has diplomatic immunity, and this property enjoys diplomatic protection. You're committing multiple federal crimes by being here. Barry smiled with genuine appreciation for Hugo's commitment to the lie that had protected his family for years. Your son confessed to systematically targeting and assaulting young women across 3 countries. Those confessions have been recorded and distributed to journalists, law enforcement agencies, and victim advocacy groups. Diplomatic immunity can't bury evidence that's already public. Hugo's composure flickered slightly as he processed the implications. His son's protection had always depended on controlling information flow, keeping evidence within diplomatic channels where it could be managed or eliminated. Public exposure changed the entire dynamic. Coerced confessions obtained through kidnapping and torture are inadmissible in any legal proceeding, Hugo said, reasserting his diplomatic authority. Whatever you've done here tonight, it has no legal standing. I'm not interested in legal proceedings, Barry replied quietly. I'm interested in justice. The conversation was interrupted by Klaus Hoffman's voice crackling through Barry's earpiece. DC Metro Police just received an anonymous tip about diplomatic personnel involved in sexual assault cases. Eleanor's contacts are already running the story. Hugo's about to lose his ability to manage this quietly. Barry saw Hugo's phone light up with incoming calls. His handlers in Washington, crisis management specialists, legal advisors who specialized in making diplomatic scandals disappear. But tonight, the machinery of protection was breaking down under the weight of documented evidence and public exposure. What do you want? Hugo asked, his diplomatic composure finally cracking as he realized his son's confessions could destroy careers and his family's influence and result in criminal prosecution that diplomatic immunity might not prevent. I want justice for every girl your son hurt. I want accountability for your role in enabling him. And I want to make sure this never happens again. Barry pulled out a tablet, displaying the evidence Eleanor Young had compiled, financial records, victim statements, communications between Hugo and officials who'd helped cover up his son's crimes. The scope of corruption was breathtaking, reaching into police departments, hospitals, and government agencies across multiple countries. You created a system, Barry continued, designed to let privileged predators hunt innocent victims without consequences. You turned diplomatic immunity into a license for systematic cruelty. That ends tonight. Hugo's phone rang again, this time showing a DC area code that made his face go pale. The call was brief, professional, and devastating. When it ended, Hugo looked older, diminished, stripped of the authority that had protected his family for decades. The State Department is suspending my diplomatic credentials pending investigation, Hugo said, his voice hollow with defeat. Moldovan officials are demanding my immediate recall. The cases your wife's journalist friend publicized are being reopened in 3 countries. Barry felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. Hugo Sanders was experiencing the destruction of everything he'd built to protect his son's predatory behavior. The diplomatic immunity that had made them untouchable was evaporating under public scrutiny and documented evidence. But justice required more than career destruction and legal proceedings. It required personal accountability delivered with precision and finality. Your son is in the guest quarters, Barry said, along with his accomplices and complete recorded confessions. You're going to walk over there, see what your protection enabled, and understand exactly what kind of monster you helped create. Hugo's composure finally broke completely as he realized the full scope of his situation. His son's diplomatic protection was gone, his own career was destroyed, and the evidence of their crimes was already public. The system he'd spent years building to shield predators had collapsed in a single night. Barry gestured toward the guest quarters with the cold courtesy of someone who'd won a war that had taken years to prepare. After you, Ambassador. It's time to meet the consequences. Chapter 8. Reckoning. The guest quarters had been transformed into a tribunal where diplomatic immunity met personal justice. Hugo Sanders stood in the doorway, staring at his son bound to a chair, surrounded by evidence of systematic predatory behavior that could no longer be buried or explained away. Hector looked up as his father entered, his face swollen from Barry's interrogation techniques, his diplomatic arrogance completely shattered. Dad, make this stop. Tell them about immunity, about protection, about how this can't happen to us. Hugo Sanders looked older than his 58 years as he surveyed the scene. His son and accomplices secured with professional efficiency, recording equipment documenting everything. Evidence of international criminal activity spread across every surface. There is no immunity anymore, Hugo said, his voice hollow with defeat. The State Department suspended my credentials 2 hours ago. Moldova recalled me, pending investigation. Every case we've buried is being reopened by authorities who finally have evidence they can't ignore. Barry stood beside a table displaying photographs of all 9 victims, their lives forever changed by the Sanders family's systematic cruelty. Ada's hospital photo occupied the center position, a 16-year-old girl who'd fought back against a predator protected by diplomatic immunity. Tell your son about Isabella Hoffman, Barry said quietly. Hugo's face went pale at the mention of the Vienna victim. That was a tragedy, a misunderstanding that escalated beyond anyone's intentions. She was 17 years old. Klaus Hoffmann's voice cut through the room as he emerged from the shadows. The Austrian father moved with the controlled fury of someone who'd spent 2 years planning this moment. She was my daughter, and your son drove her to suicide after destroying her faith in justice. Hugo stared at Klaus with growing horror as he recognized the implications. This wasn't just about Barry's daughter. It was about every victim the Sanders family had created across multiple countries, and some of their families had found each other. Eleanor Young entered the room carrying a laptop that displayed real-time news coverage of the developing scandal. BBC, CNN, Washington Post, and 12 international outlets are running the story. The recorded confessions are public, the financial records are public, and victim advocacy groups are demanding prosecution in every jurisdiction where crimes occurred. The scope of public exposure was destroying years of careful reputation management. Hugo had built his career on keeping scandals contained within diplomatic channels, but this exposure was too broad, too documented, too coordinated for traditional damage control. What happens now? Hector asked, his voice cracking with the realization that his father's protection was gone forever. Barry pulled out a secure satellite phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years earlier. Director Morrison? This is Barry Rasmussen. I have something that might interest the International Criminal Court. The conversation was brief, professional, and devastating. Barry was offering evidence of systematic international crimes committed by diplomatic personnel, documented with confessions and financial records that proved government complicity. The kind of case that destroyed careers and resulted in serious prison time. Hugo understood the implications immediately. International prosecution meant no diplomatic immunity, no political protection, no ability to disappear into comfortable exile. His son would face justice in courts designed specifically to prosecute crimes that local authorities couldn't touch. You've destroyed my family, Hugo said, his diplomatic composure finally abandoning him completely. Your family destroyed itself, Barry replied. I just made sure the world could see what you really are. Klaus Hoffmann approached Hugo with the measured steps of a father who'd waited 2 years for this moment. Isabella kept a diary. Every day, for 3 weeks after your son assaulted her, she wrote about how the system failed her, how diplomatic immunity made justice impossible. She wrote about you specifically, how you called Austrian authorities and threatened them if they pursued charges. The accusation hit Hugo like a physical blow. He'd made those calls, had used diplomatic pressure to bury his son's crimes, had personally destroyed a young woman's faith in justice. Isabella's suicide was as much his responsibility as Hector's assault. The diary is public now, Klaus continued, along with recordings of your phone calls to Austrian officials. The world knows exactly how diplomatic immunity was weaponized to protect predators. Barry activated a wall-mounted television that displayed news coverage of the developing scandal. International outlets were treating this as more than criminal justice. It was a fundamental examination of how diplomatic immunity could be abused to shield systematic criminal behavior. The coverage included interviews with victim advocacy groups, legal experts explaining how diplomatic protection had been corrupted, and politicians demanding reforms to prevent similar abuses. The Sanders family had become the catalyst for international discussions about accountability and justice. Your son's diplomatic immunity is gone, Barry said to Hugo. Your own protection is suspended. The evidence is public and the cases are reopened. But legal justice takes time, and sometimes victims need more immediate satisfaction. Barry gestured to Charlie Serrano, who entered carrying equipment that made Hugo's face go pale with recognition. As a diplomatic professional, Hugo understood interrogation techniques, coercive methods, and the kind of justice that operated outside legal channels. You have a choice, Barry continued. Your son can face legal prosecution in international courts, which will take years and might result in comfortable imprisonment in minimum security facilities. Or he can face immediate justice delivered personally by the fathers whose daughters he destroyed. The choice was clear but horrifying. Hugo could protect his son from personal retribution by accepting legal processes that might be lenient, or he could watch immediate justice delivered with the precision of fathers who'd lost faith in institutional protection. Hector looked between his father and his captors, finally understanding that diplomatic immunity had been the only thing standing between him and the consequences of his actions. Without that protection, he was just another predator facing the rage of families he'd destroyed. Dad, Hector whispered, don't let them. You did this to yourself, Hugo said, his voice carrying the weight of complete defeat. Every choice, every victim, every time you used our protection to escape consequences. You did this to yourself, and you did this to our family. Barry studied Hugo Sanders, a diplomatic professional who'd spent his career managing crises and protecting his nation's interests, now facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built to shield his son's predatory behavior. Last chance to make a choice that matters, Barry said quietly. Legal justice or personal justice? Your son faces one or the other, but he faces something tonight. Hugo looked at his son, the young man whose protection had cost him his career, his reputation, and his faith in the system he'd served for decades. The predator who'd hidden behind diplomatic immunity while destroying innocent lives. The ambassador's next words would determine how this ended. Chapter 9. Justice Served. Hugo Sanders looked at his son for a long moment, seeing not the diplomatic attaché who'd been protected by immunity, but the predator who'd systematically destroyed young women's lives across 3 continents. The weight of enabled cruelty, buried evidence, and institutional corruption settled on his shoulders with crushing finality. I choose justice, Hugo said quietly, his voice carrying the exhausted acceptance of someone who'd finally stopped running from consequences. Barry nodded with grim satisfaction. The legal kind or the personal kind? Both. The word hung in the Caribbean air like a judgment. Hugo Sanders, career diplomat, protected by decades of institutional power, was abandoning his son to face accountability that diplomatic immunity had prevented for years. Eleanor Young documented everything with professional precision, her recordings capturing the moment when diplomatic protection crumbled under the weight of documented cruelty. The Sanders family's downfall would become a case study in how institutional immunity could corrupt justice until personal accountability became inevitable. Barry activated his secure communication system, connecting to contacts in law enforcement agencies across 3 countries. Within minutes, he'd transmitted complete evidence packages to prosecutors who'd been waiting years for actionable intelligence on diplomatic crimes. Interpol will have arrest warrants issued within hours, Barry reported. The International Criminal Court is opening formal proceedings, and local authorities in Vienna, Washington, and London are reopening every case your family buried. Hector Sanders looked between his father and his captors, finally understanding that his protection was gone forever. The diplomatic immunity that had made him untouchable was evaporating under public scrutiny and his father's abandoned support. "This isn't over," Hector said, trying to maintain defiance despite cable ties and overwhelming evidence. "Our lawyers will challenge everything, claim coercion, diplomatic persecution." Klaus Hoffmann interrupted with the cold precision of a father who'd waited 2 years for this moment. "Your confessions are public. The financial records are public. The victim statements are public. Diplomatic immunity can't bury evidence that no longer exists in diplomatic channels." Barry pulled out his phone and showed Hector the real-time news coverage. International outlets were treating the Sanders case as more than criminal justice. It was a fundamental examination of how diplomatic protections could be corrupted to enable systematic predatory behavior. The coverage included interviews with victim advocacy groups, legal experts explaining diplomatic immunity abuse, and politicians demanding reforms to prevent similar crimes. The Sanders family had become symbols of institutional failure and the necessity of personal justice when legal systems couldn't reach the powerful. "You wanted to prove that diplomatic immunity made you untouchable," Barry said to Hector. "Instead, you've proven that some forms of justice operate outside diplomatic protection." Charlie Serrano entered carrying final equipment that would ensure the Sanders family faced complete accountability. Financial seizure orders, asset forfeiture warrants, and extradition papers that would follow them to any jurisdiction they attempted to reach. Swiss accounts frozen, Cayman properties seized, diplomatic pensions suspended. Charlie reported with professional satisfaction. The Sanders family just became financially accountable for victim compensation and legal proceedings. Hugo stared at the destruction of everything he'd built over a diplomatic career spanning 3 decades. His son's protection had cost him his position, his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. The institutional power he'd wielded to bury scandals was turning against him with devastating efficiency. "What happens to us now?" Hugo asked with the hollow voice of someone who already knew the answer. "Legal justice takes its course," Barry replied. "International prosecution, extradition proceedings, prison sentences that reflect the scope of your crimes. Your son faces charges in 3 countries, and diplomatic immunity can't protect him anymore." Barry paused, studying the diplomatic family that had treated victims' suffering as acceptable collateral damage for maintaining their protected status. "But first, you face personal justice." Klaus Hoffmann approached Hugo with photographs of his daughter. Isabella at 17, brilliant and hopeful, destroyed by predatory behavior that diplomatic immunity had enabled. "She believed in justice until your family taught her that power made some people untouchable. She died believing that her suffering didn't matter because her attacker had diplomatic protection." The accusation carried the weight of absolute moral authority. Hugo had personally destroyed a young woman's faith in justice, had used diplomatic pressure to bury evidence, had enabled his son's continued predatory behavior by making victims believe accountability was impossible. "Your daughter's diary is public now," Klaus continued, his voice thick with controlled rage. "Every word she wrote about how your threats made justice impossible. Every day, she documented losing faith in systems designed to protect innocence. She died because you taught her that diplomatic immunity was more powerful than justice." Hugo Sanders, career diplomat, institutional professional, finally broke completely under the weight of personal accountability. His son's crimes had destroyed multiple families, but his own role in enabling those crimes had driven a 17-year-old girl to suicide. Barry stepped forward with the calm certainty of someone who'd crossed every moral and legal boundary to reach this moment. Hugo Sanders, you used diplomatic immunity to shield systematic predatory behavior. You corrupted justice to protect a monster. You destroyed families to maintain your career. The formal accusation carried the weight of documented evidence and personal conviction. Barry had abandoned his career, risked his freedom, and crossed international boundaries to deliver justice that legal systems couldn't provide. Hector Sanders, you systematically targeted and assaulted young women while hiding behind diplomatic protection. You enjoyed psychological destruction as much as physical violence. You celebrated victims' helplessness as evidence of your untouchability. Barry looked at both Sanders men, father and son, enabler and predator, representatives of institutional corruption that had made justice impossible for too many victims. Some crimes require personal accountability when legal systems fail. The final justice was swift, personal, and absolute. Klaus Hoffman and Barry Rasmussen, fathers whose daughters had been destroyed by diplomatic predators, delivered consequences that had been impossible while the Sanders family maintained their protected status. 6 months later, Barry sat beside Ada's hospital bed for the final time as she prepared for discharge. His daughter had fought back from physical and psychological trauma with the same determination she'd shown the night she defended herself against Hector Sanders. The therapy is helping, Ada said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Dr. McGee says I'm making excellent progress, but knowing that he faced consequences for what he did to me, that helped more than anything else. Barry squeezed his daughter's hand, feeling the strength that had carried her through months of recovery. Ada had inherited more than his tactical mind. She'd inherited his refusal to accept defeat and his commitment to justice when systems failed. What happened to them? Ada asked. Legal justice, Barry replied. Hugo Sanders received 15 years for corruption, conspiracy, and accessory charges in international court. His diplomatic immunity couldn't protect him from systematic institutional crimes. Barry paused, choosing his words carefully. Hector Sanders faced personal accountability before legal proceedings began. Sometimes justice requires more immediate delivery than court systems can provide. Ada studied her father's face, recognizing the expression she'd seen when he'd dealt with threats against their family. She'd inherited enough of his analytical mind to understand what personal accountability meant in Barry's vocabulary. Good, she said with quiet satisfaction. Isabella Hoffman deserved justice too. All of us did. Barry looked out the hospital window at Washington, D.C., thinking about Klaus Hoffman, who'd returned to Austria to rebuild his life around his daughter's memory. About Eleanor Young, whose investigation had sparked international reforms to diplomatic immunity protections. About Charlie Serrano, who'd helped deliver justice when legal systems proved inadequate. Most of all, he thought about the 9 young women whose lives had been shattered by predators protected by diplomatic immunity. 8 of them would have chances to heal, to rebuild, to find peace in knowing their attackers had faced consequences. One of them, Isabella Hoffman, had found peace in the knowledge that her death had catalyzed justice for others. Some people forfeit their right to legal protection when they choose to destroy innocence, Barry said quietly, repeating the words that had guided him through months of planning and execution. Ada squeezed his hand with the strength of someone who'd survived assault, trauma, and institutional failure. Thank you for showing me what justice looks like when systems fail. Barry smiled at his daughter, brilliant, strong, unbroken despite everything Hector Sanders had tried to destroy in her. She'd inherited his tactical mind, his moral certainty, and his understanding that sometimes good people had to cross lines to protect innocence. The Sanders family had learned that diplomatic immunity had geographic and moral limitations. Justice had found them despite institutional protection, delivered with precision by fathers who'd refused to accept that power made some people untouchable. Outside the hospital window, Washington, D.C. continued its daily business of politics and diplomacy, unaware that 2 career diplomats had recently learned the difference between legal immunity and personal accountability. Justice, Barry had discovered, was sometimes a personal responsibility that couldn't be delegated to institutions. Some lessons had to be delivered personally. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.